Imagine living in a world where knowledge is scarce and expensive. Books are copied by hand on fragile parchment, and the few manuscripts that exist are locked away in monasteries or the libraries of kings. For most people in medieval Europe, reading and writing are rare skills. Stories and news are shared orally around the hearth. Information travels slowly, taking months or years to move from one town to the next. Illiteracy and superstition thrive. If you want to own a book, it might cost as much as a house, and you could never read it because you have never learned how. Then, almost overnight, an invention appears that makes words cheap and plentiful. Suddenly, new ideas can reach millions, not just monks and nobles. Reading becomes a shared activity, books become affordable, and the human mind discovers that it can shape destiny. This is the story of the printing press, one of the most important turning points in human history. In this video, when words went viral, how the printing press changed history, we will take you on an epic journey. We will explore the roots of printing in ancient China, follow the life and struggles of Johannes Gutenberg, watch as his press ignites the Renaissance and the Reformation, and trace how printing spread around the globe. We will see how printed words gave rise to new sciences, created nations, and helped ordinary people change their world. Along the way, we will weave in emotional stories of triumph and tragedy, from the monk laboring over a manuscript to the radical who risks his life printing forbidden words. And finally, we will reflect on what this history means for us today, in a world where information spreads at light speed. By the end, you will understand why the printing press was not just a mechanical invention, but a catalyst that reshaped the very fabric of human culture. Our story begins long before Gutenberg, on the other side of the world. Centuries before European monks meticulously copied texts, the Chinese had already invented the essential elements of printing. By the 2nd century CE, they had developed paper, ink, and relief surfaces for transferring text. Using woodblocks and damp paper pressed with a brush, they created printed documents. The earliest known printed works include Buddhist incantations from Japan, 764 to 770, the Diamond Sutra, 868, the earliest surviving printed book, and a 130-volume collection of Chinese classics printed in 932. Yet these early forms of printing were laborious. Each page required a separate wooden block carved with all the text. The process was effective for reproducing large runs of the same text, but editing or correcting a single character meant carving a new block. The Chinese and Korean inventors sought ways to make printing more flexible. Around 1041 to 1048, an artisan named Pai Sheng devised movable type using individual characters molded from clay and glue. These characters were arranged on an iron plate and held together by heating the mixture and cooling it again. After printing, the type could be disassembled and reused for different texts. Although ingenious, Pai Sheng's clay type had limits, it was fragile and difficult to align. A century later, another Chinese innovator, Wang Chen, carved 60,000 wooden characters and developed a revolving case to organize them. This made typesetting faster, but wood still wore out quickly. Meanwhile, in the Korean kingdom, metal movable type was being perfected. By the early 13th century, Korean printers cast bronze characters. During the reign of King Taejong, early 1400s, the government ordered 100,000 pieces of movable type to print official documents. Several fonts followed. These innovations produced books like the Jikji, a Buddhist text printed with metal type in 1377 to 78 years before Gutenberg. Despite these achievements, East Asian movable type printing did not spread to Europe. Cultural and practical obstacles played a role. Chinese writing uses thousands of characters, making it challenging to manage sets of type. Printing was often controlled by the state or religious institutions. On the other hand, the Uyghurs carried printing as far west as Egypt, but political and religious tensions may have hindered its adoption in Islamic lands. Thus, when Europeans began experimenting with printing technology in the 15th century, They were unaware of the long tradition behind them. Yet, the East Asian pioneers laid the foundation for what would become a global revolution in communication. To appreciate the magnitude of the printing revolution, we must first understand Europe before Gutenberg. During the Middle Ages, books were rare and expensive. Copying a manuscript was a tedious process. Scribes would spend months or even years transcribing text with quill and ink on parchment. Mistakes were common. Each copy contained unique errors. Only monasteries, universities, or wealthy patrons could afford to own or commission manuscripts. The average person lived and died without ever reading a book. Even kings lacked libraries by modern standards. Charlemagne, emperor in the early 9th century, had perhaps a few hundred volumes. By the 14th century, the library of the University of Paris contained around 300 volumes. When the University of Cambridge was founded in 1209, one of its first books was chained to a desk to prevent theft. Without affordable books, education and literacy were limited. Knowledge moved slowly along fragile networks of scribes and messengers. Scholars traveled to distant monasteries to consult a single copy of Aristotle. Knowledge itself was considered static. The words of ancient authorities like Aristotle and the Bible were accepted without question. In this environment, dissent or innovation could be dangerous. Heresy could lead to excommunication or execution. Oral culture dominated. Memories were the main libraries. But change was brewing. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe was beginning to awaken. The Renaissance, literally rebirth, brought renewed interest in classical texts and human potential. As trade and urbanization increased, so did the demand for knowledge. More people wanted to learn to read. The vernacular languages, Italian, French, German, English, were gaining prominence alongside Latin. Scholars like Petrarch hunted libraries for lost manuscripts. For the first time, there was a broader public eager for books. All that was lacking was a way to produce them quickly and cheaply. Enter Johannes Gutenberg, a German goldsmith born around 1398 in Mainz. Like many inventors, Gutenberg drew upon his craft, in his case, working with metals, to solve a problem. By the 1430s and 1440s, he was living in Strasbourg, where he likely began experimenting with printing. Around 1436, he started developing what would become the first mechanized printing press. Gutenberg did not invent movable type from scratch. Metal type existed in Korea, but he had no knowledge of it. Instead, he combined several innovations. The key components of his press were movable type made of metal alloys. Gutenberg cast individual letters, sorts, from a durable alloy of lead, tin, and antimony. Unlike clay or wood, metal type could produce thousands of impressions without wearing out. Oil-based ink. He formulated an ink thick enough to stick to metal type yet transfer cleanly to paper. A screw-type press adapted from wine or oil presses. Gutenberg modified existing presses used in agriculture to apply even, mechanical pressure, ensuring uniform impressions. Standardized type sizes. He designed type molds to cast letters consistently, making it easier to align lines and pages. Gutenberg's genius was not just technical but conceptual. He saw that by combining metal type, the screw press, and oil ink, he could produce books quickly and cheaply. According to historians, it is this integration that marks Gutenberg's invention as one of the great turning points in history. He essentially created a manufacturing process for books. But innovation is rarely easy. Gutenberg needed funding to continue his experiments. He borrowed money from a wealthy lawyer, Johann Fust, and perhaps from his partner Peter Schoeffer. As costs mounted, relations with investors became strained. In 1455, Fust sued Gutenberg for repayment, claiming he had misused funds. A court case ensued. Fust won and seized some of Gutenberg's equipment. The details of this lawsuit remain murky, but we know that it hindered Gutenberg's ability to capitalize on his invention. Many of his early printed materials were lost or taken by fust, yet the technology he created could not be contained. Gutenberg's most famous production was the 42-line Bible, commonly called the Gutenberg Bible, printed around 1455. It was a lavish work, produced with great care. Each page was printed with black ink, then decorated by hand with colored initials and illustrations. Approximately 180 copies were produced, an unprecedented number for such a large book. It is estimated that the Gutenberg press could print over 200 pages a day, making it possible to produce a Bible in a few months rather than years. The impact was immediate. Before printing, a Bible might cost 3 years' wages. After, they could be purchased for a fraction of that. For the first time, ordinary clergy and wealthy laypeople could own the scriptures. Literacy rates began to climb slowly as printed books made reading more worthwhile. Within a few decades, presses were active in dozens of cities across Europe. Venice alone became a book printing capital, exporting millions of volumes across the continent. Even though Gutenberg died relatively poor, his invention lived on and grew. A 2025 University of British Columbia article on literacy notes that by 1500, there were 15 to 20 million copies of 30,000 to 35,000 separate publications in Europe. This astonishing number demonstrates how quickly printing transformed the availability of reading material. The same blog notes that scholars debate how much printing drove literacy, but it acknowledges that the mass production of books democratized knowledge and produced uniform texts. People no longer relied on oral repetition or handwritten copies. They could compare printed texts and standardize learning. Printing stimulated educational and scientific movements and enabled translation into vernacular languages. As printing spread, a new economy emerged around book production. Printers invested in presses, type, and paper. They hired typesetters, proofreaders, and bookbinders. Each book required capital, but, once printed, could be sold widely. Books became commodities. Libraries proliferated. Middle-class households could now collect volumes, reflecting their interests and status. School curricula expanded beyond religious texts to include classics, grammar, rhetoric, arithmetic, and law. The rapid spread of printing changed the way people thought about information. Oral culture began to mix with a literate culture, but it did not vanish. People would still gather to hear news read aloud. The printing press thus augmented rather than replaced oral communication. Yet the authority of the written word grew. If something was printed, it seemed more reliable, an assumption that sometimes caused problems when false information or propaganda circulated. But overall, printing became a force for stability and for change. The Renaissance had begun in Italy decades before Gutenberg, but printing accelerated its spread across Europe. Renaissance scholars like Petrarch, Boccaccio, and Erasmus believed that reading the classics could renew morality and reason. Before printing, access to these works was limited. With the press, Greek and Roman texts were edited, translated, and printed in thousands of copies. Renaissance humanism, an intellectual movement that emphasized human potential and the study of classical antiquity, found a natural ally in printing. Printing also democratized art and knowledge. Painters and architects published treatises on perspective and design. Scientific texts such as Euclid's Elements and Ptolemy's Almagest were widely distributed. Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince, first printed in 1532, traveled beyond Italy to influence political leaders across Europe. Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, describing the ideal courtly gentleman, became a handbook for the nobility. The Renaissance became more than an Italian phenomenon. It became a European cultural movement. Because of printing, ideas from different regions could be compared and combined. Italian Renaissance art influenced Northern Europe. Northern humanist criticism influenced Italy. The printing press allowed for the cross-pollination of ideas. Scholars corresponded through printed books and letters, building networks that transcended borders. Standardized texts permitted debates on a level playing field. No longer could a local variant of a text carry the same authority as a widely published edition. Printing changed not only what was read, but where. Before the press, books were often chained to lecterns in monastic libraries. After, small volumes made for the home, books of hours, manuals of etiquette, and herbals became common. As the History.com article notes, printing made classical texts affordable and accessible. Printing lowered the cost of books dramatically, enabling libraries not just in monasteries, but in medium-sized towns and the houses of rich merchants. Ordinary families could own prayer books or poetry. Women, previously excluded from formal learning, gained access to reading material at home. In this subtle way, printing started to break down educational barriers. If the Renaissance was the spark, the Reformation was the fire. The printing press and the Protestant Reformation were intimately connected. In 1517, Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk and theologian, famously nailed his 95 Theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg. He was protesting abuses in the Catholic Church, particularly the sale of indulgences. He may have hoped to spark an academic debate. Instead, his challenge triggered a religious upheaval. Luther's message spread quickly, not because of the door, but because of the printing press. Within weeks, printed copies of the 95 Theses were circulating throughout Germany. As History.com notes, printing made Luther the first best-selling author in world history. He sold 500,000 copies of his writings during his lifetime. Luther recognized the power of print. He wrote in German so that ordinary people could read. He translated the New Testament into German in 1522, and his translation was printed widely. The Lutheran Bible not only spread Protestant doctrine, but also helped standardize the German language. The Catholic Church initially underestimated printing, but soon it realized the danger. Pamphlets and pamphlets multiplied faster than they could be suppressed. Censorship and book burning became common responses. However, the decentralized nature of print shops made it difficult to stop the flow. Radical writings, once produced by a single author, could now be reproduced thousands of times before authorities even knew they existed. As the History.com article notes, the printing press empowered fringe or radical voices. Dissenting sects used print to challenge orthodoxy. The Reformation also gave rise to the concept of public opinion. The notion that ordinary people could read about religious debates and form their own judgments was revolutionary. French writer Voltaire later wrote that the printing press created the public sphere in which Enlightenment ideas could flourish. In 1789, English journalist James Gilray published a cartoon depicting the revolution of the word, showing a printing press as a weapon against oppression. The idea that words could reshape power was born. Without printing, the scientific revolution might not have occurred, or it would have taken much longer to develop. Scientists needed reliable, standardized texts to build on each other's work. With printed books, astronomers, mathematicians, and physicists could access the same data and methods. They could correct each other's errors and build new theories. As the History.com article explains, the printing press aided the scientific revolution by improving the accuracy of data and enabling collaboration. One of the first major scientific works to benefit from printing was Nicholas Copernicus' De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, on the revolutions of the celestial spheres, published in 1543. Copernicus placed the sun, not the earth, at the center of the universe. His book was controversial and not widely read initially, but the fact that it was printed meant that his ideas could not disappear. They could be discovered by later astronomers. In the 1600s, Galileo Galilei read Copernicus, used his telescope to provide evidence for heliocentrism, and printed his own works. Galileo's Dialogue, concerning the two chief world systems, published in 1632, presented a fictional conversation that implicitly supported Copernicus. For this, he was tried by the Inquisition. but because his work was printed, it still circulated across Europe. The printing press also enabled mathematicians to standardize notation. François Viet introduced algebraic variables like x and y. Descartes popularized the use of superscript for powers, x squared. These notations spread quickly through printed texts, simplifying calculations. Without printing, mathematicians might have relied on local notation that others could not easily understand. Physicist and mathematician Isaac Newton published Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica in 1687, describing the law of universal gravitation. This dense work reached scientists across Europe. Newton often engaged in print debates, exchanging pamphlets with his rival Robert Hooke. In 1713, in the second edition of the Principia, Newton inserted a remark about standing on the shoulders of giants. Without printing, these scientific conversations would have been limited to a handful of scholars. In medicine, printing allowed physicians to compare their clinical observations. Andreas Vesalius' De Humani Corporis Fabrica, On the Fabric of the Human Body, 1543, contained detailed woodcut illustrations of human anatomy. By printing drawings based on dissections, Vesalius corrected errors in Galen's ancient works. Surgeons and students across Europe could now see accurate images rather than rely on descriptions. Renaissance philosopher Francis Bacon famously wrote that printing, gunpowder, and the magnetic compass were the three inventions that had changed the world most profoundly. While gunpowder and the compass reshaped war and exploration, the printing press transformed knowledge and power. Bacon recognized that printing created a new way of thinking. Knowledge is power. It gave people the tools to question authority, discover nature's laws, and build a new world. By the early 17th century, the printing press was no longer limited to books. People wanted news, especially as Europe became increasingly interconnected by trade and politics. Early newspapers were essentially newsletters, collections of letters from correspondents. According to historians, the first official newspaper is considered the Relation aller Vornehmen und Gedenkwürdigen Historien, printed in Strasbourg in 1609 by Johann Carolus. Carolus's publication reported news from foreign courts and wars. Around the same time, another paper, the Avisa Relation oder Zeitung, appeared in Wolfenbüttel. In the Low Countries, Abraham Verhoeven published the Nieuwe Tüdingen, New Tidings, which may have been printed as early as 1605. The sudden appearance of multiple newspapers within a decade signals a rising demand for news. As the Britannica article notes, early newspapers spread quickly. Switzerland saw newspapers by 1610, Habsburg territories by 1620, England by 1621, France by 1631, Denmark by 1634, Italy by 1636, Sweden by 1645, and Poland by 1661. The History.com article similarly notes that by 1605, printed newspapers like The Relation were helping to spread news and boost literacy. For the first time, ordinary citizens could read about events beyond their immediate community. They could discuss politics, markets, and wars. Newspapers created a new public sphere, a space where people could share ideas and form opinions. Coffee houses in London and Paris became centers of debate. Governments tried to control news, censorship laws were enacted, yet the desire for information proved irresistible. When governments banned certain newspapers, underground presses sprang up. The press thus became a tool for both authority and dissent. Printing also played a role in colonial expansion. European powers established printing presses in their colonies to support administration and evangelization. In 1563, the first printing press in the Americas was set up in Mexico City by Spanish missionaries. It produced catechisms and legal documents. In 1610, a press was established in Peru. In North America, Harvard College set up a press in 1638 to print religious texts. These colonial presses aimed to convert indigenous peoples and consolidate power. but they also created new opportunities for local voices. By the 18th century, colonial newspapers like the Boston Newsletter, 1704, and the Pennsylvania Gazette, 1728, were essential in the American colonies. They disseminated news, criticism, and advertisements. As printing matured, it powered a new movement, the Age of Enlightenment. From the late 17th through the 18th century, philosophers and writers like Voltaire, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Denis Diderot, and Immanuel Kant used print to challenge traditional authority and advocate for reason, individual rights, and skepticism of tyranny. With printed books and newspapers, public opinion acquired real force. The printing press gave new weight to Enlightenment salons, where intellectuals debated ideas about government, religion, and society. Newspapers and political pamphlets circulated these debates beyond salons to cafes, markets, and living rooms. According to the History.com article, printing created a network of information that helped people exchange ideas and shaped public opinion. Revolutionary tracts like Thomas Paine's Common Sense, 1776, sold hundreds of thousands of copies, despite literacy levels in the colonies being relatively low. Paine's pamphlet, printed in plain English, galvanized support for independence and inspired colonists to see themselves as citizens rather than subjects. One of the most ambitious printed projects of the Enlightenment was the Encyclopédie, published between 1751 and 1772, under the direction of Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert. This massive work aimed to compile all human knowledge and present it in a systematic, secular form. It included articles on science, philosophy, trades, and even controversial topics like political theory. The Encyclopédie was banned in some countries but smuggled across borders. Its print run, about 4,000 sets, was small, but its influence was enormous. It helped unify Enlightenment thinkers and promote rational inquiry. In the late 18th century, printing played a direct role in political revolutions. In France, pamphlets and newspapers spread revolutionary slogans like Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. Revolutionary figures like Jean-Paul Marat and Camille Desmoulins published fiery newspapers advocating resistance. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, 1789, was printed and reprinted, helping to rally support. Printing also facilitated the spread of revolutionary ideas to other countries. The U.S. Constitution, 1787, and the Bill of Rights, 1791, were printed for public reading, ensuring that citizens understood the new laws. In each case, print helped define and defend rights and freedoms. Printing also gave birth to political satire. Cartoonists and writers used print to criticize kings and ministers. English satirist Jonathan Swift wrote A Modest Proposal, 1729, and Gulliver's Travels, 1726, using humor to expose social hypocrisy. Voltaire used satire in Candide to criticize the optimism of his age and to advocate for religious tolerance. These works were printed widely and challenged their readers to think critically about authority and tradition. An important question is, how did printing affect literacy? Scholars debate this. Many factors influence literacy rates: economics, urbanization, the availability of schools, and political support for education. Still, there is no doubt that printing made reading more relevant and accessible. As early as the 16th century, printed catechisms and prayer books encouraged reading. In Protestant regions, reading the Bible became a religious duty. Over time, more children attended school, partly because printed textbooks made teaching standardized. According to the UBC article, by 1500, 15 to 20 million books had been printed, and 30,000 to 35,000 different titles existed. As printing increased supply, prices fell, making books accessible to a wider public. The same article notes that printing democratized knowledge and created uniform texts, which improved communication and comprehension. Moreover, printed books in vernacular languages allowed people to learn in their mother tongue. By the 17th and 18th centuries, literacy in some European regions reached 40 to 60%. Girls as well as boys learned to read. Reading, once an elite skill, became part of everyday life. Printing also created new genres of literature. In the 16th and 17th centuries, chapbooks, cheap booklets containing stories, ballads, or religious tracts, were sold by peddlers. In the 18th century, the novel emerged. Authors like Cervantes in Spain, with Don Quixote 1605, Daniel Defoe, with Robinson Crusoe 1719, Samuel Richardson, with Pamela 1740, Henry Fielding, with Tom Jones 1747, 1749, and Jane Austen, with Pride and Prejudice 1813, wrote stories about everyday people rather than kings and heroes. These novels were printed and read widely, especially by women. They entertained, but they also commented on social values and relationships. Printing helped build public education systems. Governments and religious authorities realized that literacy could shape citizenry. In Germany, the Lutheran emphasis on reading the Bible led to state-sponsored schools. In Scotland, the Education Act of 1696 mandated schools in every parish. In England, the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, SPCK, printed cheap Bibles and built schools. By the 19th century, mass schooling and universal literacy became goals of many governments. Printing was thus a key driver in the formation of the modern nation-state, where citizens needed to read laws, newspapers, and ballots. Printing also had complex effects on women. On the one hand, the press enabled women to author and read books, expanding their intellectual horizons. For instance, Christine de Pizan, circa 1364 to 1430, wrote The Book of the City of Ladies. Though she predates Gutenberg, her works were printed and widely read in the 15th and 16th centuries. In the 18th century, women like Mary Wollstonecraft wrote treatises on women's rights, such as A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792. On the other hand, printing sometimes reinforced gender stereotypes by distributing didactic works telling women how to behave. Nonetheless, over time, the availability of print contributed to the emergence of women as readers and writers, essential to the growth of feminism. For all its benefits, printing also had a dark side. Governments and religious authorities soon realized that print could undermine their power. They responded with censorship, licensing, and sometimes violence. The Catholic Church established the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, list of prohibited books, in 1559, forbidding the reading of certain books deemed dangerous to faith. Governments required printers to obtain licenses. In England, the Star Chamber oversaw printing and punished unauthorized presses. In France, the monarchy granted exclusive printing privileges and prosecuted unauthorized printers. Some printers went underground, creating clandestine presses. Printing could also be used as propaganda. In the 17th and 18th centuries, rulers and religious leaders used pamphlets to rally support or vilify enemies. During the English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, both parliamentarians and royalists flooded the streets with printed pamphlets. John Milton wrote Areopagitica, 1644, a pamphlet arguing for the freedom of the press. In the 20th century, printing continued to be used for propaganda, from wartime posters to government-controlled newspapers. At the same time, printed news sometimes inflamed conflicts. Reports could be exaggerated, and rumors could spread quickly. In 17th century London, pamphlets about supposed Catholic plots triggered panic and violence. During the French Revolution, radical newspapers contributed to the Reign of Terror. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, sensationalist yellow journalism in the United States stirred public opinion toward war. Print also raised legal questions about libel and free speech. Who was responsible for false statements? Printers? Authors? Governments? The struggles to define and protect free speech continue today in the digital age. But many of these debates have their origins in the era of the printing press. So far, our story has focused on Europe and colonial North America. But what about other parts of the world? How did the printing press influence Asia, Africa, and the Middle East? And how did these regions adapt their own printing traditions to the new technology? In the Islamic world, printing faced religious and political obstacles. Arabic script posed technical challenges. It required different fonts and ligatures than Latin. Moreover, some Islamic scholars believed that hand-copied Qur'ans held a sacred quality that printing might diminish. As a result, printing in Arabic script did not flourish until the 18th century. When printing was finally adopted, it was used primarily for administrative and scientific texts rather than religious works. In India, printing was introduced by the Portuguese in Goa in the 16th century. Missionaries printed catechisms in local languages. Later, the British colonial government supported the printing of administrative documents and textbooks. Indian intellectuals used print to disseminate reformist ideas, leading to debates about social issues like caste and gender. Printing also enabled the rise of Indian newspapers. In 1780, James Augustus Hickey launched the Bengal Gazette, the first printed newspaper in South Asia. Newspapers became vehicles for anti-colonial activism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Printing reached Africa through missionary and colonial channels. In Ethiopia, printing presses were established in the 1600s by Jesuit missionaries. They printed religious texts in Ge'ez. In other parts of Africa, printing advanced more slowly due to colonial policies that restricted local press freedom. Still, printing was crucial in the 20th century for disseminating nationalist ideas. Newspapers and pamphlets played a role in anti-colonial movements across the continent. In Latin America, printing arrived with the Spanish and Portuguese. In Mexico, as mentioned earlier, the first press was set up in 1539. In Peru, a press began operating in 1581. Indigenous languages were printed alongside Spanish, enabling missionaries to translate religious texts. Over time, printing became a tool for independence movements. Figures like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín used printed manifestos to rally support for independence from Spain. Later, printing helped disseminate the works of writers like Gabriel García Márquez and Octavio Paz, shaping national literatures. The story of printing does not end with Gutenberg. In the 19th century, new technology transformed printing again. Steam-powered presses replaced hand-operated presses, dramatically increasing speed and volume. In 1814, Friedrich Koenig and Andreas Bauer built the first steam-driven printing press for the Times of London. It could print 1,100 sheets per hour, a huge increase over manual presses. Later innovations included the rotary press, invented by Richard March Hoe in 1843. It used cylinders to print on continuous rolls of paper, enabling print runs of tens of thousands of copies. These advances led to the rise of mass circulation newspapers like the New York Times, founded 1851, and Le Petit Journal, founded 1863. Printing became a big business. Advertising revenue funded journalism. For the first time, newspapers could be sold for a penny, accessible to the working classes. This penny press in the United States covered crime, sports, and human interest stories, making news a part of daily life. Print now shaped not just politics and religion, but also entertainment and consumer culture. In the late 19th century, Ottmar Mergenthaler invented the linotype machine, 1884, which automated typesetting. Operators could type text on a keyboard, and the machine would cast entire lines of type as metal slugs. This dramatically reduced the time and cost of setting type. The linotype remained dominant until the mid-20th century when phototypesetting and digital publishing replaced it. By the late 20th century, new technologies once again transformed information. Photocopying, television, computers, and the internet reduced the dominance of print. In the digital age, Anyone with an internet connection can publish instantly. Social media and electronic books, e-books, have changed reading habits. But even in this new world, print remains influential. Books and newspapers still hold a certain authority. Many readers prefer the tactile experience of paper. And the history of printing continues to shape how we think about information. The digital revolution owes much to the printing revolution in its emphasis on mass communication and accessibility. Throughout this journey, the printing press has touched not just institutions, but individual lives. To bring this history alive, let's share a few stories. In a small monastery in the late 1400s, Brother Matthias labors over a copy of the Bible. Each line he writes must be perfect. Mistakes mean scraping the vellum and rewriting. He's been at this for months. His eyes ache in the dim light. One day, a traveling merchant arrives with a small printed book. It contains the Latin Psalms, printed in black with red initials. Brother Matthias is stunned. The letters are uniform, the pages crisp. When he learns that this book was printed dozens of times over in a few weeks, tears come to his eyes. Part of him is relieved. The work of copying may become easier. Another part is anxious. Will monks like him still have a purpose? The printing press threatens his livelihood, but promises to spread the words he cherishes to many. Brother Matthias decides to embrace it. He becomes one of the first monks to operate a press at his abbey. In 16th century Germany, a young woman named Anna hears the sermons of Luther. She cannot read Latin, but she can read German, thanks to a small Bible her father purchased. One day, she attends a clandestine meeting where she receives a printed pamphlet criticizing the sale of indulgences. Inspired, Anna becomes a pamphleteer. Late at night, she helps her husband, a printer, produce illegal tracts. She smuggles them into baskets of bread. Each pamphlet encourages ordinary people to think for themselves and challenges corruption. Anna risks her life, but she believes that God wants her to spread truth through print. Her courage shows how printing empowered women and laypeople to shape ideas and resist authority. In 18th century Paris, a salon hosted by Madame Geoffrin buzzes with conversation. Philosophers like Montesquieu and Voltaire gather to discuss the latest printed essays. On the table lies a copy of the Encyclopédie. Madame Geoffrin, who never attended school, delights in reading new articles. She invests money in a printer to produce her own edition of letters from female correspondents. Through print, she gains a voice and fosters a community of thinkers. Her salon becomes a center of Enlightenment thought. In 18th century Boston, a black man named Prince Hall obtains a printing press with help from abolitionist allies. Hall, a former slave, uses the press to publish pamphlets demanding the abolition of slavery and equal rights for Black Americans. He collaborates with white abolitionists like Samuel Sewall, who wrote The Selling of Joseph, 1700, one of the earliest anti-slavery tracts printed in New England. Hall's pamphlets circulate among free blacks and sympathetic whites, planting seeds of liberation. The printing press becomes a weapon in the battle for justice. Fast forward to the 21st century. A young writer named Maya self-publishes her novel using print-on-demand technology. She grew up loving printed books, but writes digitally. By uploading her manuscript online, she can print single copies on demand. She sells her book through an online retailer and sees readers from around the world buying it. The printing press has evolved into digital printing, but the goal is the same: to share stories widely. The printing press might seem like ancient history, but its legacy is all around us. We still use printed books in schools and courts. Printed constitutions, declarations, and treaties remain anchors of law. The press invented the concept of copyright, which protects authors' rights. It introduced page numbers, indexes, and standardized citations, tools that underlie modern scholarship. The global circulation of ideas, the growth of science, and the democratization of knowledge would not have been possible without the printing press. In a world flooded with digital information, the story of the printing press reminds us of the power of words. It challenges us to think critically about how information is produced and consumed. It teaches us that new technologies can liberate and oppress depending on how they are used. And it shows that individuals, from Gutenberg to Anna to Prince Hall, can harness technology to change history. As we close this journey, think about your relationship with words. Every time you pick up a book or scroll through your phone, you are an heir to Gutenberg's revolution. You can access ideas that once would have been hidden behind monastery walls. But with this power comes responsibility. In an age of misinformation, choose your sources carefully. Support libraries and independent bookstores. Encourage literacy programs. Share stories that inspire empathy and truth. Just as the printing press turned Europe's world upside down, so can our choices today shape the future. As writer and philosopher Cicero once said, "If you have a garden and a library, you have everything you need." Now you can have a library in your pocket. Let's honor the printing press by using words to build, not destroy, to connect, not isolate, to educate, not mislead. If this video sparked your curiosity, please like, subscribe, and share. Join our community of history lovers who believe that understanding the past can empower us to make a better future. Let us know in the comments, which moment in the history of printing surprised you most? How has reading changed your life? Let's keep the conversation and the revolution going.